Close your eyes for a second. Actually, don't. You're watching a video. But just follow me here. Picture standing on a flat, empty plain. The ground under your boots is fine red dust, like powdered rust that goes on forever. The sky above you is not blue. It's not even gray. It's this pale, brownish pink, almost like a bruise that won't heal. The sun is there. You can see it. But it looks smaller than you're used to. Like it got tired halfway through the morning and decided to dim itself down. It's midday, and the temperature is around -10 degrees Fahrenheit, which, by Mars standards, is actually a warm day. By tonight it'll drop to -120. There's no sound, not wind, not birds, not even the low hum of a city far away. Nothing. Just absolute total silence in every direction. The kind of silence that doesn't feel peaceful. It feels like the planet is just waiting. Now here's the thing. Some people, serious, credentialed, brilliant people, look at that place and don't see a dead world. They see a project. The biggest construction project in the history of our species. They look at that frozen, airless, radiation-soaked rock and genuinely believe that one day, maybe not soon, maybe not in your lifetime or mine, but one day, people could step outside on Mars without a suit, breathe real air, feel actual wind, watch clouds roll in. Is that a dream? Yeah, absolutely. But is it only a dream? That's what we're here to figure out. And I'm not going to give you a simple answer, because there isn't one. What I'm going to give you is the real science, the actual problems, the actual proposals from actual scientists. And by the time we're done, I think your understanding of what's possible is going to be genuinely different than when you started. Welcome to Brain Twist. If you're new here, I'm really glad you found this. We do deep dives on science, space, and the kind of questions that don't have clean answers. If that's the kind of content you want in your life, go ahead and hit subscribe right now. It's free, it takes 2 seconds, and it means you won't miss what's coming next. And if you're already part of this community, thank you. Genuinely. Now let's get into it. The word terraforming comes from Latin. Terra means earth. Forming means, well, forming. So terraforming literally means earth forming, making something more like Earth. The concept has been in science fiction for almost a century. Writers like H.G. Wells and later Kim Stanley Robinson built entire universes around it. But the first time it showed up in serious scientific literature, not a novel, not a film, but an actual academic journal, was 1961. A scientist named Carl Sagan, who most of you probably know from Cosmos, published a paper in the journal Science suggesting that Venus could potentially be seeded with microorganisms to alter its atmosphere. He got the Venus chemistry wrong, as it turned out. But the idea itself, that humans could deliberately and systematically change the atmosphere of another planet, that was now on the table in a real scientific conversation, not just a story, a question. By 1973, Sagan had shifted his attention to Mars. He published work proposing that dark dust or plants, maybe algae, could be introduced to Mars to lower its albedo. Albedo is just a fancy word for reflectivity. Mars reflects a lot of sunlight back into space. If you could make the surface darker, it would absorb more heat. More heat means the frozen CO2 in the polar ice caps starts to sublimate, turn directly from solid to gas. And that adds to the atmosphere. More atmosphere means more pressure. More pressure means liquid water becomes possible. And so on. It's a chain reaction. That's the core idea of terraforming Mars. You don't have to do everything at once. You just have to start the chain. But here's what even Sagan understood. Even in 1973, starting the chain is not the same as finishing it. And finishing it is where things get genuinely complicated. Before we can talk about changing Mars, We need to really understand what Mars is right now. Not the version from a movie. The actual planet, with actual data. Mars is the fourth planet from the Sun. It's about half the diameter of Earth. Its gravity is 38% of Earth's. So if you weigh 180 pounds here, you'd weigh about 68 pounds on Mars. That sounds fun until you realize lower gravity has serious long-term effects on the human body. But that's a whole other episode. The Martian day is actually pretty close to ours. 24 hours and 37 minutes. The Martian year, though, is about 687 Earth days. So seasons exist on Mars, but they last roughly twice as long as ours. Now the atmosphere. This is where things start to get stark. Earth's atmosphere is dense enough to support liquid water, protect us from radiation, allow us to breathe, and regulate temperature. The pressure at sea level on Earth is about 1 atmosphere. Scientists call it 1 bar. That's the baseline. Mars. The average atmospheric pressure on Mars is about 0.6% of Earth's. Not 6%. 0.6%. If you were standing on the Martian surface without a pressurized suit, your blood would begin to boil. Not from heat, from the lack of pressure. The dissolved gases in your blood would turn to bubbles. You'd be dead within a minute or two, probably less. The atmosphere that does exist is about 95% carbon dioxide, about 3% nitrogen, about 1.6% argon, and tiny traces of oxygen and water vapor. There is oxygen on Mars, just not nearly enough and not in a breathable form. Average surface temperature on Mars is about -80 degrees Fahrenheit. At the equator during summer, temperatures can briefly hit 50 degrees Fahrenheit in the afternoon. But at the poles and at night, we're talking -195 degrees Fahrenheit. That's not a typo. And then there's radiation. On Earth, our thick atmosphere and our magnetic field work together to protect us from most of the harmful radiation coming from the Sun and from deep space. On Mars, both of those shields are essentially gone. The radiation levels on the Martian surface are roughly 40 times higher than what we experience on Earth. Long-term exposure at those levels significantly raises the risk of cancer and damages DNA. So that's the starting point. Thin atmosphere, extreme cold, deadly radiation, and air that can't sustain human life, even in principle. That's what we're working with. For a long time, and I mean decades. The popular scientific idea about terraforming Mars focused on warming the planet first. The logic was actually pretty solid on the surface. Mars has CO2 locked up in its polar ice caps. It has more CO2 potentially trapped in the soil and in subsurface ice. If you could release all that CO2 into the atmosphere, you'd create a greenhouse effect. Temperatures rise, ice melts, more CO2 gets released, more warming. The chain reaction starts. The most talked about ways to do this included redirecting sunlight with giant orbital mirrors, crashing ammonia-rich asteroids into the planet to release greenhouse gases, or manufacturing and releasing synthetic greenhouse gases. Chemicals like perfluorocarbons that are thousands of times more effective at trapping heat than CO2. These aren't crazy ideas. These are things physicists and planetary scientists have genuinely modeled. And the warming chain itself. Yes, it could work, at least in principle. The problem is what happens after the warming. Specifically, how much atmosphere could we actually generate? In 2018, a pair of NASA scientists, Bruce Jakosky from the University of Colorado and Christopher Edwards from Northern Arizona University, published a study in the journal Nature Astronomy, and this study went through every known reservoir of CO2 on Mars, the polar ice caps, the soil, the clays, everything that scientists have identified and measured. And they asked a direct question: If we released all of it, how much atmospheric pressure could we actually create? Their answer was uncomfortable. Even if you released every accessible bit of CO2 on Mars, every single reservoir we know about, you would get to somewhere between 1 and 4% of Earth's atmospheric pressure. At best, maybe a little more. But definitely not enough for liquid water to be stable at the surface. Definitely not enough for humans to breathe, not even close. Now, there might be CO2 we haven't found. Deeper in the crust, maybe. Some scientists think there could be more there. But based on what we know and have measured, the math doesn't work out the way early terraforming models hoped it would. So the simple version, just warm it up and let the planet do the rest, isn't enough. The planet doesn't have enough raw material to finish the job on its own. That doesn't mean terraforming is impossible. It means the path is harder than the original roadmap. And the next problem makes it harder still. By the way, if you're finding this genuinely interesting, and you haven't subscribed to Brain Twist yet, now's a good time. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you actually see part 2 when it drops. We're going to get into some things in the second half of this series that are going to genuinely change how you think about this topic. I want you there for it. All right, back to Mars. Here's something that I think most science content doesn't spend enough time on, because it's not as visually dramatic as melting ice caps or crashing asteroids. But it might be the single most important obstacle to terraforming Mars, and it's almost always mentioned as an afterthought. Mars does not have a global magnetic field. Earth does. Earth's magnetic field is generated by the movement of liquid iron in our planet's outer core. As the Earth spins, that liquid iron circulates, and the movement of that electrically conductive material generates a magnetic field that surrounds the entire planet. Scientists call it the magnetosphere. The magnetosphere does something remarkable. It deflects the solar wind. The solar wind is a constant stream of charged particles, mostly protons and electrons, that pours out of the sun in every direction, at speeds of around 1,000,000 miles per hour. Without our magnetic field, that solar wind would constantly slam into Earth's upper atmosphere and gradually strip it away, particle by particle, over millions of years. We know this isn't a hypothetical. We've watched it happen. Not to Earth, to Mars. Evidence gathered from orbiters like NASA's MEMVN spacecraft, which has been studying the Martian upper atmosphere since 2014, shows that Mars is actively losing atmosphere right now. The solar wind is stripping ions from the top of the Martian atmosphere at a measurable rate. Not fast by human standards, but geologically, it's significant. And scientists believe this is exactly what happened to Mars billions of years ago, on a massive scale. Mars almost certainly had a thicker atmosphere in its early history. Some models suggest it may have even had liquid water on its surface, not just for a few minutes on a warm afternoon, but flowing rivers and maybe even shallow seas. There are geological formations on Mars that look for all the world like ancient riverbeds and lake basins. The Curiosity rover has been driving around in what is almost certainly a dried-up lake for years. But then something happened. Around 3 to 4 billion years ago, Mars's internal heat engine began to die down. The liquid iron in its core started to solidify. The circulation slowed, and the global magnetic field weakened and eventually collapsed. Without that shield, the solar wind went to work. Over hundreds of millions of years, it stripped the atmosphere down to almost nothing. The water either evaporated away or froze into the soil and the polar ice caps, where most of it still sits today. So here's the cruel irony at the heart of terraforming Mars. Even if you somehow fixed the atmosphere, Even if you spent centuries engineering a thick, warm, pressurized blanket of air around that planet, the sun would start taking it apart, slowly, but relentlessly. Without a magnetic field, you'd be pouring water into a bucket with a hole in the bottom. Maybe a small hole, but given enough time, the bucket empties. So what do you do about that? This is the part where science starts to blur the line between engineering and science fiction. And I mean that in the best possible way. In 2017, at the Planetary Science Vision 2050 workshop in Washington, D.C., NASA scientist Jim Green and a team of colleagues presented a concept that raised eyebrows. They proposed placing an artificial magnetic dipole shield at the Mars L1 Lagrange point. Let me unpack that. A Lagrange point is a location in space where the gravitational pulls of two large bodies, in this case, the Sun and Mars, balance out. At the L1 point, which sits between the Sun and Mars, an object placed there would essentially stay in a stable position relative to both bodies without using much fuel to maintain it. Green's team proposed putting a large spacecraft at that point. A spacecraft carrying a superconducting loop that generates a powerful magnetic field. Not a field around the spacecraft. A field large enough to extend past Mars. A magnetic umbrella, essentially, shielding the entire planet from the solar wind. Now I know what you're thinking. That sounds insane. But here's the thing. The physics doesn't rule it out. The math works, at least in the model. And Green's team actually ran simulations, showing that under such a shield, Martian atmospheric pressure could roughly double over the course of just a few years, as the planet stopped losing atmosphere faster than it was being added. Is the technology to build that shield something we have right now? No. Superconducting magnets of that scale, power systems to run them, the infrastructure to deploy them, none of that exists yet. But none of it is physically impossible. We're not talking about breaking any laws of nature. We're talking about engineering challenges. Genuinely massive ones. But engineering challenges. And that distinction matters because there's a difference between impossible and incredibly hard, and we don't know how to do it yet. Let's talk about water, because this is actually one of the more hopeful parts of the Mars story. For a long time, Mars was thought to be essentially dry. A dead desert world with maybe some frost here and there. But as our missions to Mars have gotten more sophisticated, the picture has changed dramatically. The Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, launched in 2005, carried ground-penetrating radar that could look beneath the surface. And what it found was striking. Massive deposits of water ice beneath the Martian soil, particularly at the poles, but also at mid-latitudes. A 2018 paper in the journal Science estimated that the North Polar ice cap alone contains enough water ice that if it melted, it would cover the entire planet to a depth of about 18 feet. Not a puddle. 18 feet of water across a whole planet. Then in 2018, researchers using the Mars Ice Radar instrument on the Mars Express Orbiter reported something even more dramatic. They detected what appeared to be a liquid water lake buried about 1.5 miles beneath the South Polar ice cap. Roughly 12 miles across, not frozen, liquid, kept liquid by the pressure of ice above it and possibly by the heat of residual geothermal activity below. Now, there's been some debate since then about whether this is actually liquid water or just wet sediment. The science isn't completely settled, but the broader point holds. Mars has water. A lot of it. More than we thought. Mostly frozen, some possibly liquid, and all of it potentially a resource. For terraforming purposes, that water matters enormously. Water is not just for drinking. When you split water molecules through a process called electrolysis, you get hydrogen and oxygen. Oxygen you can breathe. Hydrogen you can use as fuel. Water is also essential for the kinds of plant life that would eventually be needed to help build and maintain a breathable atmosphere. And water vapor is itself a greenhouse gas. It helps trap heat. The water is there. The question is getting to it, releasing it, and doing something useful with it at a planetary scale. Okay, so let's say, just for the sake of the conversation, let's say we committed. As a civilization, we decided this is what we're doing. We put the resources in. We started the process. How long would it take? The honest answer is, nobody really knows. And the estimates vary wildly depending on what assumptions you make. But let me give you a sense of the range scientists and researchers have actually discussed. The most optimistic timelines, and these are truly optimistic, built on assumptions about technology we don't have yet. Talk about a couple of centuries to get Mars to a point where humans could survive outside in a basic suit without dying instantly. Not breathing the air yet, but surviving the pressure and the temperature. Maybe 200 to 500 years in the most optimistic scenarios, a middle of the road estimate, factoring in realistic technology development and the known problems with atmosphere loss, tends to land somewhere between 1,000 and 10,000 years. Yes, I said 10,000 years. That's not a misprint. The most conservative scientific estimates, taking the magnetic field problem seriously and working with the CO2 numbers from the 2018 Nature Astronomy study, suggest that full terraforming, meaning breathable outdoor air, stable liquid oceans, and a self-sustaining ecosystem, could take anywhere from 100,000 to 1,000,000 years, even with active human intervention throughout. 1,000,000 years. That's roughly how long modern humans have existed. Think about that. We'd be asking our descendants to carry forward a project for as long as our species has been on Earth. That's not a reason to call it impossible. Civilizations think on long timescales when they need to. The ancient Egyptians built the pyramids without knowing who would see them thousands of years later. Cathedrals in medieval Europe took multiple generations to complete. Our ancestors planted trees they knew they'd never see fully grown. But it does reframe the question. Terraforming Mars isn't a project for this century. It might not even be a project for this millennium. It's a project for a species that has decided it wants to become multi-planetary in a deep, permanent, geological sense. Here's something that doesn't come up enough in these conversations. Even if you solved the atmosphere, even if you solved the magnetic field, even if you warmed the planet and released the water, you still don't have a livable Mars without life itself. And not just human life, microbial life, plant life, the invisible, unglamorous stuff that actually makes a planet work. On Earth, the oxygen in our atmosphere isn't a geological accident. It was created by life, specifically by cyanobacteria, about 2.5 billion years ago. Before cyanobacteria evolved the ability to do oxygenic photosynthesis, Earth's atmosphere had almost no free oxygen. These microscopic organisms spent about 300 million years pumping oxygen into the atmosphere. We call it the Great Oxidation Event. It changed everything. If we want Mars to eventually have breathable air, we're almost certainly going to need biology to do it. We can't manufacture enough oxygen industrially at planetary scale. The numbers don't work. We'd need organisms, engineered specifically for Martian conditions, that can begin converting CO2 to oxygen over long timescales. Scientists have already started thinking about this seriously. There's a whole field called synthetic biology that's exploring how to engineer microorganisms for extreme environments. Researchers have been studying organisms called extremophiles, life forms that survive in conditions that would kill almost anything else. Boiling hot springs, deep ocean vents, frozen Antarctic lakes, highly acidic environments, highly radioactive environments. Some of these organisms have features that, with the right engineering, might be adaptable to Martian conditions. Not tomorrow, not in a decade. But the research is happening, it's real, and it's building towards something. The idea that we might one day send engineered microorganisms to Mars as the first wave of terraforming, a living vanguard that begins the slow process of changing the chemistry of the planet, is no longer just science fiction. It's a legitimate area of scientific discussion. Okay, we are deep into this now, and I just want to check in for a second. If this is the kind of content that makes you think, that actually makes you sit with something longer than a 30-second clip, then Brain Twist is your place. Hit subscribe if you haven't already. Leave a like on this video. It genuinely helps more people find this channel. And honestly, the more people who think deeply about this stuff, the better. Okay, back to Mars. There's a dimension to all of this that science communicators often skip over because it's philosophically messy. But I think it's important. Before we start engineering Mars, before we deliberately seed it with Earth microorganisms and start the process of changing its atmosphere, we need to be really, genuinely sure that Mars doesn't already have life. I know, that's a big if, and we have not found life on Mars. Every mission we've sent there has come back without definitive evidence of living organisms. But here's the thing. We haven't looked that hard. We've been driving rovers across the surface, yes. We've analyzed soil samples. We've detected methane fluctuations that, on Earth, would almost always mean biological activity, though they could also have geological explanations. But we haven't drilled deep into the subsurface. We haven't sampled that buried liquid water. We haven't gone to the places where life, if it existed on Mars, would most likely be hiding. If Mars does have life, even microbial life deep underground, then terraforming the planet is an entirely different ethical and scientific conversation. You'd be deliberately ending an independent genesis of life. The only other known example of life in the universe. That's not a small thing. This is why organizations like NASA take planetary protection extremely seriously. Every mission to Mars has to go through strict contamination protocols to prevent Earth organisms from hitching a ride and contaminating the environment before we've had a chance to really look. The answer might be that Mars is sterile. It probably is. But probably isn't the same as certainly. And before humanity commits to the biggest planetary engineering project ever attempted, it seems worth being absolutely sure. So here's where we are at the end of part 1. Mars is extraordinarily hostile. Its atmosphere is too thin and the wrong composition. The CO2 locked up in the planet can't generate enough pressure, even if all of it were released. The solar wind is actively stripping the atmosphere because there's no magnetic field to stop it. The temperatures are brutal. The radiation is lethal. And even if we started tomorrow, we might be talking about timescales measured in thousands or millions of years. And yet, and I want to be really clear about this, none of this it can't be done. The magnetic shield concept has real physics behind it. The water is there. The biology might be engineerable. And every decade, the obstacles get more specific, which means the possible solutions get more specific too. There's a difference between a problem that's unsolvable and a problem that's incredibly hard. Mars might be the hardest problem our species ever decides to tackle. But hard and impossible are not the same word. Now we're going to go further. We're going to look at what real proposals are on the table right now, the ones being funded and studied. We're going to talk about what it would actually mean for human civilization to attempt something like this, And we're going to ask the question that I think is even more interesting than could we? Which is, what would we become by trying? That's coming up next. Make sure you're subscribed to Brain Twist so you see it the moment it drops. Leave a comment below. I genuinely read them. And tell me, do you think humanity should attempt to terraform Mars? Not could we. Should we? Because that question has an answer that science alone can't give you. Thin atmosphere, no magnetic field, brutal cold, radiation hitting the surface at 40 times what we experience on Earth, and the best scientific estimates telling us that even if we released every single drop of CO2 locked up in the planet, we'd still only have a fraction of the atmospheric pressure we actually need. That's where we stopped. And if that's all you took away, you might have walked away thinking, okay, terraforming Mars is basically a fantasy. A beautiful one, but a fantasy. Every single one of those problems I just listed, every single one, was at some point in history said about something else. Powered flight, the eradication of smallpox, putting a human being on the moon, mapping the entire human genome. At some point, each of those things had a list of problems attached to it that looked just as impossible as the list we just went through. And yet, so now we're not retreating from the difficulty. We're going deeper into it. Because that's where the most interesting science lies. Not at the comfortable edges of what we already know how to do, but at the messy, uncertain, genuinely open frontier where researchers are actually working right now. We're going to look at real proposals, real experiments, real funding. And then we're going to ask the question that I think matters more than any of the technical ones. What would it mean for us, as a species, to actually try this? Welcome back to Brain Twist. If you're joining us for the first time, please subscribe and follow us. Let's start with something concrete. Because I think one of the ways science communication fails people is by making everything sound either already solved or hopelessly theoretical. The reality of where terraforming research actually sits right now is more interesting than either of those. There are real experiments happening, real papers being published, real money being spent, not on full terraforming, we're nowhere near that, but on the building blocks, the component technologies, the proof of concept work that would need to happen before anything larger could even be considered. Let's start with the one that's probably the most tangible. MOXIE, the Mars Oxygen in Situ Resource Utilization Experiment. MOXIE was a small gold box, about the size of a car battery, that rode along with NASA's Perseverance rover when it landed on Mars in February 2021. Its job was deceptively simple. Take the carbon dioxide in the Martian atmosphere and convert it into oxygen. The process it used is called solid oxide electrolysis. You heat the CO2 to extremely high temperatures, around 470 degrees Fahrenheit, and run it through a special electrochemical cell. The carbon and oxygen atoms separate. The oxygen gets collected. The carbon monoxide gets vented away. MOXIE ran multiple times during Perseverance's mission. And it worked. Not in huge quantities. At its best, it produced about 10 grams of oxygen per hour, which is roughly what a small plant does. But that's not the point. The point is that it proved the process works in actual Martian conditions, in actual Martian atmosphere, on the actual surface of Mars. A 2023 paper published in the journal Science Advances documented the full results of MOXIE's operation. The researchers noted that scaling this technology up from a car, battery, sized device to something the size of a building is a genuine engineering challenge, but not a fundamental scientific obstacle. The chemistry works. Now it's an engineering problem, and engineering problems, unlike physics problems, have a track record of getting solved when enough resources are thrown at them. That's not a small thing. That's a real milestone. Now let's talk about something that sounds almost too clever to be real. But it's been peer-reviewed and published, so let's take it seriously. In 2019, a team of researchers from Harvard, NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and the University of Edinburgh published a paper in the journal Nature Astronomy, proposing a material-based approach to localized terraforming on Mars. Not planet-wide, but region by region. The material they focused on is called silica aerogel. You might have seen aerogel before. It's that eerie, almost ghostly solid that looks like frozen smoke. It's one of the least dense solid materials ever created. And it has a remarkable property. It's an incredible insulator, while still being transparent to visible light. Here's what the researchers proposed. If you spread a layer of silica aerogel, just 2 to 3 centimeters thick, over a section of the Martian surface, the results could be dramatic. Visible sunlight would pass straight through the aerogel, just like it passes through glass, but the infrared radiation, the heat, would be trapped underneath. It's essentially a passive greenhouse, sitting right on the ground, with no moving parts, no power requirements, no maintenance. Their models suggested that a 2 to 3 centimeter aerogel layer could raise surface temperatures by up to 150 degrees Fahrenheit. On Mars, that would be enough to create liquid water conditions in the covered region. Enough, potentially, to support photosynthetic life underneath. Think about what that actually means. You wouldn't need to change the whole planet first. You could start small. Cover a valley. Cover a crater basin. Create a patch of habitability and study what happens. Use it as a laboratory, and slowly, over decades or centuries, expand it. The paper wasn't claiming this solves terraforming. The authors were very careful about that. But it demonstrates a pathway to making specific regions of Mars hospitable without solving all of the planet-scale problems first. It's a workaround, and sometimes the best engineering is a clever workaround. Okay, this is the section that I personally find the most mind-bending. So stay with me here, because this is where the science starts to feel genuinely like science fiction. Except it's not. We talked in part 1 about how Earth's oxygen atmosphere was created by biology. Cyanobacteria spent hundreds of millions of years converting carbon dioxide into oxygen through photosynthesis. And that process literally changed the chemistry of our entire planet. We need something similar for Mars. Industrial oxygen production can't do it at planetary scale. Biology can. The problem is that nothing alive on Earth today could survive on Mars. The temperature swings alone would kill almost any organism we know. The UV radiation is extreme. The soil chemistry is harsh. Martian soil contains perchlorates, which are toxic salts that would destroy most microbial cells. But here's where synthetic biology enters the picture. Scientists are now able to do something that would have seemed like pure fantasy 50 years ago. They can edit the DNA of living organisms with precision, not crudely, not randomly, with genuine targeted control over specific genes and specific traits. A 2020 study from researchers at the University of California, San Diego looked at extremophile organisms, life forms that survive in conditions that would kill normal organisms, and began mapping which specific genes were responsible for their resilience, radiation resistance, cold tolerance, perchlorate metabolism. These are real traits that exist in real organisms on Earth. They've evolved here in places like deep sea hydrothermal vents and the frozen soil of Antarctica. The researchers weren't building a Mars microbe, but they were identifying the genetic toolkit that might eventually go into one. And work like this is happening at multiple institutions now, under the broader umbrella of astrobiology and space synthetic biology. The concept being discussed seriously in the scientific community is this: before humans arrive on Mars in large numbers, or perhaps alongside early human missions, we send engineered microorganisms specifically designed to begin the slow chemical work of changing the Martian soil and atmosphere. Pioneer organisms. The first living things intentionally placed on another planet. They'd start breaking down perchlorates, start fixing nitrogen, start producing oxygen in trace amounts, start building organic matter in the soil that future, more complex plants might eventually be able to grow in. This isn't one experiment away from happening, but it's also not 1,000 years away from being scientifically plausible. The gap between where synthetic biology is today and where it would need to be for early Mars bioengineering is measured in decades of serious research, not centuries. I'd be doing you a disservice if I spent this whole video only presenting the case for terraforming Mars, because there are serious scientists and philosophers who think the whole enterprise is wrong, not impractical. Wrong. The argument goes something like this: Mars, as it exists right now, has scientific value that we cannot fully measure. It is a preserved record of a planet that evolved differently from Earth. Its geology, its chemistry, its atmospheric history. All of it tells us things about how planets form and change that we cannot learn from Earth, because Earth's history has been so thoroughly transformed by 4 billion years of life. The moment you start releasing gases and warming temperatures and introducing organisms, you begin overwriting that record. Not all of it. Not immediately. But once you put engineered microbes in the soil of Mars, you can never fully put them there. Once you change the atmospheric chemistry, you change what future scientists can learn from studying it in its original state. And then there's the life question again. The philosopher and astrobiologist Charles Cockle has written extensively about what he calls the intrinsic value of planetary environments. His argument isn't sentimental, it's scientific. If Mars turns out to be completely lifeless, then yes, perhaps its value to us is primarily as a future home. But if there's any life there at all, even a single microbial lineage clinging on in some subsurface pocket, then that life represents an independent origin of life in the universe. The only one we've ever found besides our own. And in that case, Cockle argues, the ethical weight of that single microbial lineage is essentially incalculable. I'm not here to tell you which side of this debate is right. Honestly, I find both sides compelling. But I think the debate itself is important, and I think it should be happening loudly and publicly, not just in academic journals. Because the decisions about whether and how to terraform Mars won't ultimately be made by scientists alone. They'll be shaped by public opinion, by governments, by international bodies, and by the values that a civilization chooses to act on. Which means this conversation belongs to everyone, not just the people in the labs. We can't have this conversation without talking about the elephant in the room. Or I suppose, the rocket on the launch pad. Elon Musk has been publicly committed to Mars colonization for decades. SpaceX's stated long-term mission, it's right there in their company documentation, is to make humanity multi-planetary. The Starship rocket, which has been in development and testing for years, is explicitly designed with Mars in mind. It's big enough to carry large numbers of people and large amounts of cargo. It's designed to be refueled in orbit. It's designed to land on Mars. Now, Musk has also talked about terraforming Mars specifically. He's spoken publicly about the idea of detonating nuclear devices over the Martian poles to vaporize the polar ice caps and release CO2 quickly. He's called it nuking Mars. And whatever you think of Musk personally, the idea itself has been discussed in scientific literature. It's not something he invented. It's just very fast, very aggressive. And the 2018 Nature Astronomy paper we discussed in Part 1 suggests it still wouldn't release enough CO2 to make a breathable atmosphere. It might help with warming, but it doesn't solve the fundamental atmospheric pressure problem. More broadly, the commercial dimension of Mars exploration changes the timeline of everything in ways that are hard to predict. Government space programs work on decade-long cycles tied to political budgets and changing administrations. Private companies work on different timescales. They can move faster when they want to. They're less constrained by consensus. Whether that's good or not depends a lot on what decisions get made and by whom. A private company deciding to seed Mars with engineered organisms is a very different thing from an international scientific body making that decision after decades of deliberation. The technology might be the same. The governance is completely different. This is one of the reasons scientists keep emphasizing that the conversation about Mars, both the science and the ethics, needs to be moving faster than it currently is. Because the pace of rocket development is not slowing down. And the questions of who decides, and by what authority, and under what ethical framework, those questions deserve answers before the first shovel hits the Martian dirt, so to speak. We're in the home stretch of Part 2 now. And I just want to say, if you've been with this video from the beginning of Part 1 all the way to here, that genuinely means a lot. This is the kind of content that takes real attention to follow. And the fact that you're still here tells me you're exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. If you haven't already, please subscribe to Brain Twist and leave a like on both parts. It makes a real difference for how many people find this channel. And if something in this series made you think differently about something, drop it in the comments. I genuinely want to know what landed and what didn't. Alright, let's finish this. Let's say humanity decides, as a collective, deliberate choice, that Mars is where we're going. Not just to visit, to stay, to build. Over centuries, what would the realistic step-by-step path look like? Not the fantasy version. The version where we work with the science we've actually got, and the science we can reasonably project developing. Phase 1 would probably look like what's already being planned. Small crude outposts, mostly underground or heavily shielded, to deal with the radiation. Life support systems that recycle air and water in closed loops. MOXIE type systems scaled up to produce enough oxygen for the habitat. Greenhouses, pressurized, enclosed, growing food. Early robotic manufacturing of basic materials from Martian soil. The goal in this phase isn't to change Mars, it's to survive on Mars. Phase 2, maybe decades into a sustained presence, might involve beginning to release greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Not nuclear detonations. More likely, large-scale industrial production of powerful synthetic greenhouse gases that can be manufactured using Martian resources. Perfluorocarbons, specifically, have been modeled extensively. They're thousands of times more effective at trapping heat than CO2, and they're chemically stable. They'd stay in the atmosphere for a long time. The scale of production required would be enormous. But with enough industrial infrastructure on Mars, it's within the realm of calculation. If that warming phase worked over a century or two, you might start to see some of the polar ice sublimate. Atmospheric pressure increasing, temperatures rising enough that liquid water becomes possible in some regions and some seasons. Not everywhere, not permanently, but beginning. Phase 3 might be where biology takes over from industry. Once temperatures have risen enough and some liquid water is available, you begin introducing engineered organisms, microbes in the soil, photosynthetic organisms in protected regions, the aerogel covered valleys perhaps. Biology begins doing what biology does: adapting, spreading, modifying the environment slowly. Oxygen begins to accumulate, fraction by fraction, over centuries. Phase 4, and this is so far in the future that it almost feels irresponsible to put a timeline on it, would be an atmosphere thick enough and warm enough and oxygen rich enough that humans could survive outside without pressure suits, maybe with an oxygen mask, not barefaced outside, that's further, but survivable, and then, at some point beyond that, maybe breathable. Maybe a sky that looks blue from certain angles. Maybe weather. Maybe rain. Each of those phases is separated from the next by generations of human lives, by technologies we haven't invented, by scientific challenges we haven't solved. But each one follows logically from the one before it. The chain of reasoning holds together. Here's something that I think often gets missed in these conversations. The value of attempting to terraform Mars isn't just the destination. It's everything we'd figure out in the process. Think about what the Apollo program gave us. The actual goal was to put humans on the moon and bring them back safely. But the technologies developed along the way, integrated circuits, memory foam, water filtration systems, scratch-resistant lenses, cordless tools, the foundations of modern telecommunications. Those things changed life on Earth in ways that had nothing to do with the moon. Now multiply that by an order of magnitude. Terraforming research would require advances in atmospheric science, climate engineering, synthetic biology, materials science, energy production, closed-loop agriculture, and planetary geology. Every single one of those fields has direct applications to problems we face here on Earth right now. We are, for example, living through a period of rapid climate change. Understanding how to engineer a planetary atmosphere, how greenhouse gases behave, how to introduce them and control them, how to model climate systems at planetary scale. That knowledge has direct relevance to the planet we're already living on, not as a reason to neglect Earth in favor of Mars, but as a recognition that the science cuts both ways. Or consider closed-loop life support. If you can build a system on Mars that recycles air, water, and waste indefinitely with no inputs from outside, you've built something with massive implications for sustainability on Earth, for isolated communities, for disaster response, for regions of the world where clean water and clean air are already scarce. The pursuit of an impossible, seeming goal has a long history of producing things we didn't expect and couldn't have planned for. That's not a reason by itself to attempt terraforming Mars. But it is a reason not to dismiss the research as irrelevant to the here and now. Okay, I want to spend some time here, because I think this is actually the most important part of the whole conversation, and it's the part that pure science can't answer. The question of whether we could terraform Mars is a science question. It has a science answer, even if that answer is still incomplete. But the question of whether we should try, that's a different kind of question entirely. It's a question about values, about identity, about what we think the purpose of our civilization actually is. One view is this: the universe is vast and mostly empty and indifferent, and life, especially conscious, curious, creative life, is extraordinarily rare and fragile. Everything we know about consciousness, about art, about love, about science, about meaning, exists in one thin biosphere, on one small planet orbiting one average star, in one of hundreds of billions of galaxies. Putting that existence on one planet seems, from this perspective, like an extraordinarily risky configuration. Spreading life to other worlds isn't arrogance. It's prudence. It's the responsible thing for a species that understands its own fragility to do. Another view says, we have not finished our obligations here. There are billions of people on Earth without clean water. without adequate food, without access to healthcare or education. The resources that would go toward a centuries-long terraforming project could address immense, immediate human suffering. And there is something troubling about a civilization that looks up at another planet and says, "Let's fix that one," while not finishing the work of fixing this one. A third view holds that these aren't opposites, that the same curiosity and ingenuity and drive that pushes us toward Mars also pushes us to solve problems here. That these impulses aren't in competition. That a species capable of dreaming about terraforming a planet is also capable of feeding everyone on this one, if it chooses to. I don't know which view is right. I'm not sure any single one of them is entirely right. But I think sitting with all three of them, holding them all at once, and letting them push against each other, that's actually the beginning of a serious answer. And I think that's worth doing. Especially now, because the decisions are not as far away as they used to be. Let me bring this home with some clarity. Because I want to leave you with an accurate picture, not an inspiring one that oversells the optimism or a deflating one that undersells the possibility. Here is where we actually are. We have sent more than 50 missions to Mars since the 1960s. About half of them have failed. Space is hard. But the ones that have succeeded have given us an extraordinary picture of the planet. We know its geology, its weather patterns, its soil chemistry, its radiation environment. We know about its water. We know about its atmosphere. We have driven rovers across its surface. We have flown a helicopter in its sky. We have produced oxygen from its atmosphere. We understand the problems. We do not yet know how to solve all of them. The magnetic field problem does not have a confirmed solution, only a proposed one that hasn't been tested. The atmospheric pressure problem is harder than early models suggested. The timescales involved are almost incomprehensible by human standards. But here is also true. The research is real and it is ongoing. The biology is being developed. The materials are being tested. The engineering is being modeled. The conversation, the serious, peer-reviewed scientific conversation, is more active and more detailed than it has ever been. Terraforming Mars is not something happening in our lifetimes. It may not be something fully achieved in 10 lifetimes. But the groundwork being laid right now, the MOXIE experiments, the aerogel research, the synthetic biology work, the magnetic shield modeling, that groundwork is real. And every generation that builds on it moves the project from impossible to merely unfinished. There is a version of the future where humanity never goes back to Mars after a few crude missions, where the cost and the difficulty and the competing priorities here on Earth pull us back inward. That's a possible future. There's also a version where we go, and we stay, and we build, and we change the planet slowly over centuries and millennia. And 10,000 years from now there are humans standing under a Martian sky that is slightly more blue than it is today. And they know. They actually know that the air they're breathing exists in part because people in the early 21st century pointed a small gold box at an alien atmosphere and proved that the chemistry could work. Both of those futures are real possibilities. Which one we end up in is not decided by science. It's decided by choices, by priorities, by what we're willing to commit to, and what we're willing to hand forward to people who haven't been born yet. That's the most human thing about all of this. Mars doesn't care what we decide. The universe doesn't care. But we do. And that might be exactly the point. We started this series standing on a cold red plain in silence. And we end it here. Not with a clean answer, because there isn't one, but with something I think is more valuable than a clean answer. A real map of where the science is, where the gaps are, what the stakes are, and what it would actually mean to try. Could we really terraform Mars? The honest answer is, we don't fully know yet. But we know more than we did. And we know the right questions now, which is how every real scientific story begins. Thank you for spending this time with Brain Twist. Genuinely. Both parts of this took a lot to put together, and the fact that you watched it all the way through means everything to this channel. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do. It's the single best thing you can do to help this content reach more people. Leave a like, drop a comment, share it with someone who'd actually care about this stuff. Next time, we're going somewhere just as ambitious. And I think it's going to surprise you. I'll see you there.